exhibitions over in Venice, Vienna. And so this year, they had one called Spontaneous Interventions. It was about intervening in your communities in new and unexpected ways. And so we thought, our studio in San Francisco, we thought how we might reuse the cinema part of art history, which is a big thing.
Very exciting. Is that does it even make the art behind?
It's the same thing. Yeah,
right.
it's the design art.
Okay. So amongst many things, his designs have been honored on a Biennale, local, regional, and national AIA, it's IIDA, and Planning Design Excellent Awards. Paul earned his Bachelor's of Architecture at Cornell with honors, and has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, Cornell University, and SCAD, which is in Savannah. He was named Outstanding Young Architect of the Year.
A few years.
Awesome. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
So, hey everybody, welcome. Nice to see you all. Before we start, I thought I would just take a show of hands. How many folks have heard and understand the word biomimicry? So it's not an education process for it. So what we'll do is we'll actually define it a little bit, put it into the context of how our practice works with it, and then Cheryl and I wanted to spend the next hour with you guys talking about some case studies in which our respective practices have looked at cultural and ecological influences to define design solutions.
And before we go, I'd like to just get an understanding of how many people are associated with a university or something on this island. And how many from an outer island? And how many from, not from Hawaii? Okay, thanks. So we're about half neighbor island and Oahu. Good, thanks. That will come in play a little bit later.
So, defining this. So what I wanted to do is, I don't really have to define this for the room, but just to kind of go over that. Biomimicry that's universally accepted, but I deeply believe this, is that every single answer we're looking for our planet, especially in regards to the way we intervene in the built environment, those answers are already here and they have been for thousands of years. And really what it requires us to do is actually look at how nature would have solved those problems, biologize the process, and then find the answers within it. And so we're going to talk about that today. Our practice, HOK, Hellmuth, Obata, Kassabaum, a number of years ago, back here, formed an alliance with Janine Benyus. And so how many folks have read Janine's book? So a number of folks have here in the room, okay. So Janine Benyus is the woman who, in a way, might be the mother, if you will, of biomimicry. She wrote this book called Biomimicry. Take off your shoes and socks. No shoes and socks. So we took off, it was a little bit of a challenge for me, because I am a city boy. Took off my shoes and socks. And she walked us out of the conference room. So we left this. We would have walked out into the forest. That's what the first thing we did. And we spent the day sitting out in the forest, walking around. And what she wanted to do is she used it as an example of how physically connecting ourselves to the soil and actually lifting our hands and touching the leaves and trees of the branches themselves reminded us that we are part of the cycle of life in nature itself, and that nature essentially creates a holistic way in which it survives. It has no waste. It uses recycling redundancy as part of the way nature solves and learns from itself and creates an environment that's self-sustaining. So the next slide. So what we did is we actually worked with Janine and we invested in some research, and the research is essentially called the genius of the biome.
And you see them representing the major features. In the middle is a central ceremonial plaza, and where performances, and it was designed so that there can be ceremonial entrance into it, both by performers as well as by attendees. Ohia trees will line the walkways, accentuating the sense of arrival to the building. And there is an entry stone, entryway made of pahaku stones. again, symbolizing the sense of arrival. And these are stones from the site, so using the natural materials. The central ceremonial plaza looks towards Mauna Kea on one side, and on this side looking towards the town of Hilo. This is the center, this is the pico of the area, and there is a grand staircase, I think there's a picture, yeah, the grand staircase is made of repurposed stones, from the site that have been brought into the making of the grand staircase. There is a sculpture garden. We're looking at the sculpture garden, this is an interesting rendering, through glass wall out into the garden. So this would be a hallway within the building, looking through, so bringing the outside in and the inside being part, again, creating that harmony between the environment and the, so the walls basically are disappearing. This is in the inside, the performance hall. The wood slats in the ceiling actually allow natural light to come through. This symbolizes the many layers of achievement, the light of knowledge, the kukui, the elements of knowledge and learning at many levels and depths. This inspirational interpretation was made to create pride, meaning, and connection for current and future generations. The Hawaiian Language College is attempting to achieve LEED status in silver. The site, based on having native vegetation, building materials, and the wood was all met the Forest Stewardship Council standards. There is no use of CFC refrigerants. Half of the construction waste has been repurposed rather than going to landfills. The lighting and occupancy sensors, which of course we also saw when we came into the here today, creates maximum daylight and views and reduces the need for energy by 20%. There's natural ventilation in the classrooms for thermal comfort control systems and management of the indoor quality and low VOS emitting materials we use. There's a photovoltaic system which has enhanced commissioning of the building to reduce energy needs. Recycled materials and content. Stormwater management has limited the disruption and pollution and reduction in water use by 30%. And there is a preferred parking area for people with carpools and fuel-efficient vehicles. So basically, for this example, I'd like to thank WCIT for allowing me to use their presentation that they often give, although they'll give it much more eloquently, I'm sure. The next example that I'd like to share with you is the Omidyar campus on Princ School. And it's a very interesting situation because many of you are probably, through your schooling, familiar with the concept of ahupua'a. And this is just one of many different ways of displaying it so that the resources from the mountain to the sea are what are needed to sustain the population. And so there's, in general, there's a concept of the stream running through it, so there's some fresh water, there's, you see, in this example, you see a fish pond in the ocean, gathering fish. And all the parts, all the zones, if you will, of the ahupua'a are meant to sustain the population in that ahupua'a. It's far more complicated than this picture can possibly depict because there's a very sophisticated management system for ensuring proper practices, not fishing at the wrong times and planting in the correct times and harvesting in the correct times. But this somewhat, if you will, stylized depiction of an ahupua'a is an important concept because Princ School held a eco-charrette prior to the formation of the ideas for the building that they wanted to have. And coming out of that was the design goal of replicating an ahupua'a through the campuses that they would be creating. Like University of Hawaii Manoa, Princ School is in the Waikiki Akupua'a, not too far from each other. They were not only going to build a new kindergarten, grade 1 classrooms, but they were going to renovate the historic Wilcox Hall, which was adjacent. I guess I'd like to also, as they were proceeding with the design, and they were about, I understand, almost halfway through the process, Pierre Omidyar offered them a challenge grant of $6 million that if they would upgrade their goal from silver to platinum, that he would give them $6 million to do so. So it became a game changer for them in many ways, and they, I'll kind of get to the end of the story, they were successful in doing it. Pierre's children go to this school, and he's been a wonderful influence in Hawaii. We were so lucky when he moved here, and he's really been a leader in sustainability and in community building towards sustainability. So this school was actually named after his foundation. Of course, green materials were used. There is an eco bioswale. I have a better picture of it coming up. So there's the eco biosystem, and there's actually, I don't have a picture of it, but there's actually a windmill that helps keep some of the energy that causes the flow of the water through the campus.
They have a natural stream in their school?
There is a stream that goes through Manoa, and they've diverted some of it down through here. And by the way, the Omidyar Foundation, if you're familiar with the LEED system, they had to move up approximately 10 points. So they had to get between 53 and 63 points, and they were able to succeed in getting up from 45 to 57 after the 65, excuse me. They have a number of low-emitting materials for adhesives, sealants, paints, floorings, woods. They have light systems that enhance the use of natural light and are able to diffuse it to not ever really have to have anything other than the natural light. And their goal also applied not just to design. A lot of times we think about it in design terms, but it applied to the construction company who had to essentially redo their work and how they were going to recycle their waste and how they were going to use their construction methodologies that would help them achieve the end results. So those of you at UH Manoa, you should wander down and take a look at it. The historic Wilcox Hall is the one on the right there. And so they had, they were fitting into an existing campus, fitting into an existing land system. So that completes the two examples that I wanted to share with you as to how Hawaiian practices are similar and have a lot to work with the biome system. So Paul's going to do a third facility in Hawaii.
So a few years ago, my practice was engaged to work with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to create the Pacific Regional Center here on the islands. And so if you guys know, if you're familiar with NOAA, NOAA is essentially the national administration of the United States federal government that's responsible for our atmosphere and our water. And so the Pacific is obviously an enormous territory. And so the Tsunami Warning Center for the United States sits here on Oahu. There's something like 17 different line offices and divisions. And so what they ask us to do is work with them to create a one NOAA environment. I think they're in something like 12 to 20 different locations across the islands. and they wanted to bring them together largely so that they could actually work together. In fact, the first meetings where we were actually beginning the conversation around this was on many occasions the first time people in NOAA across the islands had ever met one another. And so the administration of NOAA felt it was extraordinarily important to create the kind of serendipity and cross-pollination between their own personnel that any department should have. So we were invited to come over, and NOAA, working with the Navy, identified a spot here on Ford Island, and part of the reason why is that's where their ships, NOAA has ships which actually regularly go out into the ocean on a continual basis, both doing research on marine life, and also they also patrol the seas. And in addition to that, every fishing fleet that goes out usually has some agent from NOAA out there with them, so that they're making sure that they're sustainably harvesting, as opposed to just, rapaciously gathering fish or doing things that they shouldn't do. There's all kinds of protocols and rules about how one fishes. And so the police for the fishing fleets are part of NOAA, and they also come back here and dock on site. So it seemed like a likely spot. There were some challenges, and so if we go to the next slide, what I wanted to do is sort of walk through the Biomimetic Challenges we looked at. And so, there were a few things that seemed fairly obvious if you're going to work with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. One is that water would be a central challenge. And how would we responsibly deal with water, and how would we deal with the atmosphere? So I have just a handful of examples of how we looked at principles and walked you through what that means. And so I'm going to both explain the project, but through the lens of the genius of the biome. So the next slide. Okay, so you can see here how these are the different aspects of that, and that all roll up under life's principles for water. And so these were the definitions we used. So we actually took this, working from the Genius of the Biome document, took that. Next. Okay, so, on any given site, and certainly in the Ahupua'a that Cheryl showed you, nature's principle around surface roughness increases infiltration is simply a given. Nature, left to its own devices, doesn't waste water. It actually uses all water on site, virtually all water on site. So the principle for a design practice to look at was, how do we take that, apply it to a relatively flat site that's already developed, and not discharge any water back into the storm sewer system. So what we did is we looked at varied and multiple surface barriers to increase infiltration. And we also looked at the ability to use velocity and paths to purify water. So that idea of slow it, sink it, and store it really became part of the way we approached water in terms of water that was actually coming onto the site and water that was being used in the project. And so the next slides are a little bit about the project itself. So in 1942, this is a photograph of two of these air hangars. So I don't know how many folks have actually been on Ford Island and seen these. So a number of people. And so they didn't look like this when you were on island. They looked like this during the war effort. And out here was the enormous apron. And these are the tie downs for all the planes that would actually be, coming through. And so the hangars were essentially enormous factories where they were taking planes in and out, working on them, and then they would be going right back out into the war effort. They were designed by Albert Kahn, who is one of the noted industrial architects of the mid-20th century in the United States. And if you go back one of the things I thought was so prescient about Albert Kahn's work is that, here's this photograph of the Pantheon on his wall. And of course the Pantheon used no mechanical systems at all. A 2,000-year-old building that only used passive ventilation and natural light to actually act as the entire mechanical system for the project. And it still is today. So Kahn took this idea of passive air and natural light and then built the hangars that way. You can actually see here how they were actually blacked out though, because in the evening when they'd still be working, they didn't want the Japanese Imperial armed forces to be able to see them if they were flying over. So the skylights were opened up, but they were blacked out. And so in the evening you could still be in here and work. That's why you see less light. But you can see the thing under. When we arrived on site, this is what they looked like. They'd pretty much been left to just simply decay since the war ended. They are a National Historic Landmark because it is Ford Island and Pearl Harbor. But no one had done anything to do with preserving them. So they've just been sitting there for the last 50 years in a kind of state of decay and ruin. But you can see the enormous, if you go back one slide real quick, you see the huge volume in that? I mean, enormous, big open shed. And then this is what they look like on the outside. So what we were hired to do is create a campus for NOAA. It's about 35 acres. This is the existing apron. The runway was out here, it's a grass runway. Hangars 175 and 176, and the support buildings for NOAA, and these are the docks where the ships come in. So what we did is we looked at these giant ruined hangars as a gift. So our first purpose was to restore them so that they're honored as part of our heritage, as part of the military war of the United States. So they were restored, and then we conjoined them with a new pavilion. And what that gave us was a 150,000 square foot shed. And inside the shed, we designed a campus that actually moves underneath that huge voluminous roof and rises up into the rafters. Because we had to put about 825 people into the building, including laboratories, Tsunami Warning Center, the National Monuments Organization, all of the things that NOAA does here on the Hawaiian Islands. And this is an aerial view of what the complex looked like when we were finished. Everything including photovoltaic arrays, solar thermal roof efforts, all of the telescopes and radar equipment, and antennae in the building. And these are new passive cooling units, which I'll explain what they mean. So beginning with the water story, here is the 20-foot grid, which was the tie-down for the planes. What we did is we took that, and we had to, because there is no current public transit to the site, virtually everyone will have to carpool, shuttle, and drive on site. So we had to park them. So we proposed reusing the apron on the 20-foot grid, which coincidentally works perfect for parking. And then the next step is how to take this enormous water runoff. So if we get the next slide. So what we proposed to do is we had to calculate all the concrete, because the concrete is historic. So working under the purview of 6 preservation agencies and historic organizations. I mean, anyone who's ever worked in that situation understands, from the Department of the Interior, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, all the way to the local Hawaiian bureaus. We're all part of this. So what we did is we measured the amount of concrete, we took the concrete, excised it, and have repurposed it in different areas on the site, and created these bioswales so that we can take and slow, sink, and store the water underground. So the next thing we did is there's a fair amount of rainfall that falls on this. So this huge roof becomes a kind of watershed itself. You know, typically water like that is taken off, put into a drain a drain system, and then just essentially put back into a storm sewer system and taken off, you know, reprocessed somewhere else. So what we propose to do is actually take it down the existing historic leaders and then channel it back into the site, and then also out here into a filtration system so that the water is recirculated. These are the passive cooling units. And what we did is we drilled a deep seawater well about 1,500 feet below the down, so it's below the ocean floor. And we take the water, and the water is actually brought to the roof of the building, and then I'm going to explain what that means next. So that had to deal with energy. And so using water as a way to create an energy solution meant looking at life's principles and life's design. And so what we did is
Can we go forward?
yeah, is in this situation, actually I'll just move to the energy story here with using light. So in this situation, what we did is we actually looked at the lessons that nature has in terms of creating energy and optimizing energy sources. So if you think of how a tree organizes itself, a tree is a perfect construction in how light can be borrowed and optimized. Every single leaf on a tree is like your thumbprint. Every one of them is unique, and they each have a purpose for being where they sit on the tree. So the outer leaves have a responsibility to do certain things with how light hits them and how they actually disperse it. And so as those leaves hit light, they actually also reflect light. And each leaf begins to reflect light in a more diverse and optimized and scattered way so that light eventually reaches inside of the tree. So the tree becomes a self-processing organism. It's not just borrowing it from the shroud. It's actually, it knows and has learned over time how to drive and optimize it because it's pushing it further into the tree. So each leaf becomes a solar cell, able to photosynthesize and create energy, which then it uses to keep itself alive. So we did this, as we said, flexibility is the way in which we can optimize light's availability and use it to create energy optimization. So if we go to the next slide. That's a noisy little thing, isn't it? What's the door? Oh, okay.
Sorry, Grant, you just have to stand maybe a door stop.
So what we said is, trees have this adaptive leaf morphology. How can we as designers take a 150,000 square foot roof and take that principle and adapt it to our project? So here's what we did. This is the building. The next slide shows you, these are the existing glazing systems. There are light monitors and there were windows, but you could be about 125 feet from a window. And as you know, light itself only will bounce in and have an impact about 30 feet from a window. Beyond that, you have to supplement it with electrical sources, just so that you have the same amount of lumens on a desk surface or a working surface when you're about 25 to 30 feet away from a window. So that meant there would have been a big energy load for this project just to keep a uniform light source across the entire space. So what we did is we did a whole series of calculations on how we would bring natural light in and how we would create a way to disperse and reflect and deflect that light throughout the facility. So we came up with a grid and came up with the size of the interventions, about a 4-foot square, simple skylight that went on the roof. And then internally, here's an image of what that space looks like if we added no electrical lighting. This is what it would be like to be in there during the day. Pretty dark shed once you filled it in. And we did radiance studies to show, so we could test it in terms of both heat, coolness, and energy loads. So if we add the skylights in a regular way, suddenly you have illumination. You have luminance on surfaces throughout the space, but you have hot spots. So what you have is spots with much more lighting and spaces that fall more deeply into shadow. If you were just here and this wasn't occurring, it wouldn't actually seem so noticeable. But it's the discrepancy between brightness and shadow which actually creates a perception that you're in a darker place. So then what we did is we continued the testing through the programs. And the next slide was, if we used nature's design and used the idea of the leaf concept and just dispersed light by reflecting it, so we introduced a whole series of diffusers that both let light come through, but eliminate those hot spots, and created some kind of more honorific chandelier fixtures which actually kind of capture light, kind of bring it deeper into more open spaces, whereas these diffusers largely sit over more work areas. We were able to create an even level of illuminance across the entire inside of the shed. And then this is a visualization of what that will feel like when it's finished. So another optimization using energy and water was the principle of how nature, taking water from subsurface pulling it up through a tree, through pulses, which actually pull water up into the top of the tree, because you're using adhesion and cohesion to pull it up. When water's taken to the top of the tree, it actually becomes part of this cycle of self-sustenance for the tree. So just as light comes in and the leaves absorb and reflect, they're part of this sort of, one unit organism, so too does water pull from subsurface coming up. Because what the water does is it actually acts as a kind of cooling vapor within the leaf structure itself. So it allows the tree canopy to protect the understory of leaves. So the whole thing's working from above and below all at one time. So we took that principle, and what we did is we looked at how we could take advantage of water on site. So the next slide is the deep seawater well I mentioned a little while ago, brings water up, and if you hit the next slide, it takes it and pulls it into these passive cooling units, which sit essentially like a series of chimneys spaced equidistantly across the roof. And on this site, the prevailings are current and constant about 97% of the time. So I think if you hit the next one, go back. So the animation didn't work. It's like it's not working. So this is actually an animation which is not working. So what happens is this air comes through, and it's actually entrained inside of this polycarbonate shed right here that sits atop this cooling unit. This water that's coming through these pipes is essentially put into a series of coils, and the coils are chilled to about 60 degrees. This air is at a constant 72 to 85, nearly 97% of the time. And it's moving almost all of the time. So as the air comes and passes over these coils, its temperature drops from 72 to 85 to about 60 to 65, just by passing over the coils. And we do a couple of things at that point. We blast it with really like an electric light, kind of like what teenagers have in their bedrooms, remember that in the 70s and 60s. And it eliminates the mold and particulate. So it's sort of blasted to clean air, and then it's desiccated through a series of trays, which when it goes through this process of going from warm to cool, it has moisture in it. And we wring the moisture out, and then we recirculate that moisture, that condensate, we take it away. And then what you have here is fairly dry, clean, cold air. And simply what happens is it falls through this stack, and it's diverted into underfloor areas. These are all raised floors, which all the data, telecom, and everything's happening under the floors, as is the air disbursement. As it moves under here, there's essentially a series of dials all over the place, and you can tune your own space. If you're a little cool, you just shut them down a little. If you want to have a little more coolness, you open them up a little bit. And the air, as it warms, it rises through the space and then eventually out. So what this is showing you is red is the warmest surfaces, blue is the coolest surfaces, and green is temperate. So for the first 7 to 8 feet above the floor, the temperature is somewhere between 72 to 76 degrees in a near constant temperature range. Of course, as in more open areas, it gets warmer as it's rising out. But what this means is that we're able to create, and so here's a diagram of how that worked. You go to the next slide.